Well, I was wrong, huh? um, so, that was the end of season 1 of Lord of the Rings Rings of Power. Um, and I don't really have much to say that's spoiler free here, so I'm just gonna say that I liked this episode a lot, and in a vacuum, it is probably my favorite episode of the show. But I'm troubled by some of its implications for the larger narrative going forward. Um, into future seasons. Now, that aside, let's talk the major spoilers. So, obviously, the two big things that happened here uh, were that the stranger was revealed to be Gandalf and Halbrand was revealed to be Sauron. Um, one of which I was 100% confident in basically from the start, the Gandalf thing. And the other thing, everyone else was super confident about, apparently, but I didn't see happening at all. um, right from his first appearance, everyone has been saying that Halbrand is Sauron. I never saw basically any argument for that. There really wasn't any part of the show during which I, even for a moment, actually believed that. Or even really considered it. It just seemed like a weird fan theory that came out of nowhere. Um, but apparently those people were onto something. I will rewatch the show with my parents later this year, and hopefully I will catch some of the clues that people apparently saw, because I did, like I said, I got nothing from Halbrand that even remotely suggested this. Um, and the stranger being Gandalf was very obvious to me from the start, which is interesting because the stranger being Gandalf has been a weirdly controversial thing. Like, it became clear to a fair number of people fairly early on, and a lot of people really didn't like it. And I don't agree with those people. I don't see what the issue is with the stranger being Gandalf. I mean, I get that the issue is that it's not lore accurate for Gandalf to exist in this time period, but who cares? Is it a good story? Is the question. And so far, I think it's fairly compelling. I think this is a very interesting look at the idea of Gandalf's origin. This idea that he arrived in Middle Earth not knowing who he is, not knowing what was going on, as sort of a very naive person, and that what would ultimately become his personality, what would ultimately become the Gandalf we know and love, was shaped by the people he met and the kindness he experienced at their hands. Is, I think, a really compelling idea, and I don't see why people are complaining about it. That said, the execution leaves something to be desired in this particular episode. Namely, I don't quite see how it makes sense that those three servants of Sauron, Eminem and her friends, thought he was Sauron. Why would they think that? Why did they expect Sauron to fall from the sky? Was that a thing that was supposed to happen? Was there some kind of prophecy I'm not aware of? Uh, why were they so certain this guy was Sauron? I, I, I don't get it. So I think that left a lot to be desired. I also think that particular scene, like the whole sequence with the Harfoots and Gandalf and the three women in the forest, was just kind of weirdly edited. Like, the cuts felt off. It felt like there were sequences missing and cut out. I didn't quite... It didn't make sense how people were getting from point A to point B in the scene. It felt like everyone was just teleporting around the clearing. That could just be me, though. I haven't seen a lot of criticism of that online, so maybe that's like, maybe I missed something that made it make sense. I don't know, but the scene just felt off to me. The actual point of the scene, however, I loved. I loved the reveal of him as Gandalf. Um, I loved the visual of the true forms of the three creatures that were presenting as women for this scene. I loved the effect of them turning into butterflies and flying away. That was cool. When he like blew them away. I still don't know what they were. My guess would, well, I was going to say they're some kind of lesser Maiar, because what else would they be? But I mean, Gandalf is a lesser Maiar. Why would he so easily defeat three of them? So either they're like even lower ranked Maiar, or, and this is actually more likely based on their appearance when he like unmasks them, they could be like proto-Nazgul. They could be elves and humans who served Sauron and were sort of quote-unquote rewarded for their service by being transformed into these creatures by him. I can see that potentially being a thing. In general, I think that, like, I don't know that there's room for something like that within the established Tolkien lore, but I've already also established that I don't particularly care about book accuracy here, except when I think the lack of accuracy is to the show's detriment, which I will get to in a moment when I talk about Sauron. So yeah, I like the fact that the show is maybe putting a bit more magic into the setting, a bit more visually impressive and overall just over the top magic than is present in Tolkien. I do like the sort of really low magic vibe going on in Tolkien, like this extremely high fantasy setting, but the actual magic that characters have access to is pretty subdued. But I also like this approach where you have characters like Gandalf and like Sauron elsewhere in the episode, and like these three mages. All of these characters use magic that is a lot more impressive in its effects, and a lot more like what you might see in other fantasy settings than what we actually see in Lord of the Rings. And I don't necessarily think that those two things are incongruous with each other. I think that a pretty significant theme of Tolkien's work is that the Third Age is kind of inherently less magical than earlier ages. So I do think that Tolkien would maybe approve of the idea that the kind of magic that Gandalf uses would have been more impressive and more powerful in the Second Age than it is now in the Third Age. Yeah, those are my thoughts on that particular sequence. As for the rest of the Harfoot Gandalf storyline, I don't like that Sadok died, mostly because I really liked Sadok. I think he was one of the more delightful characters of the show, and in particular, I think the actor playing him was incredible. Like, that guy delivered a truly phenomenal performance in this show. I don't know the actor. Apparently, he's quite famous. I don't watch a lot of TV or movies, so I haven't encountered him before. But apparently, he's like a fairly big name actor, from what I understand, especially compared to some of the lesser known actors in the show. But whoever he is, this was a great performance and a great character and really well written character. Sadok in general just was a highlight of the season. So I'm sad. I am sad to see him go, and I feel like he didn't get a lot to do in this episode before dying. Um, I am less sad to see the wider Harfoot cast presumably leave the show, because I'm guessing that in season 2 we will only be focusing on Nori and Gandalf. Um, However, I am quite sad to see Poppy go. I think Poppy was, well, I just, I think Nori needs her Samwise. And that's, well, actually, I was going to say that, but really, I feel like Poppy is more, I feel like Nori and Poppy are more Merry and Pippin, not just because their names sound similar, but just in general. I feel like there's more of a Merry and Pippin dynamic there than a Frodo and Sam dynamic, because with Frodo and Sam, as much as I love their dynamic, it is a very unequal dynamic. It's very much a master-servant dynamic, in addition to a friends slash, if you ask me, lovers dynamic, than you get with Poppy and Nori. But I still wish that Poppy had gone with them. And I do think that Poppy's actress is quite talented and quite charismatic, and I think that it would be foolish to not bring her back. So either I was wrong earlier and we are going to keep getting scenes with the rest of the Harfoots, with Poppy being our main point of view, or Poppy will eventually join Nori and Gandalf after all. I'm hoping for the latter, because I feel like that trio could have a good dynamic. So, hoping for that. Kind of disappointed that she's not there. But other than that, everything about the scene of Nori leaving the Harfoots, going off with Gandalf, everything about Gandalf's speech to her, everything about her conversation, her farewells with her dad and Poppy and her stepmom, I think it was all very, very charming and cute, and I didn't have any problem with it. It felt like exactly the kind of sort of like bittersweet but also very saccharine sweetness that you expect from the Hobbits, and that's what we got. So just in general, I have very few complaints about this storyline in this episode. Before I move on to the Sauron thing, I'm gonna briefly talk about the other storyline that very briefly features in this episode, which is Numenor. The only thing we really get there is that storyline is weird, actually, in this episode, because it doesn't resolve itself at all. It doesn't even really end on a cliffhanger. Like, Isildur's sister goes up to the Palantir and, I guess, looks into it, but we don't see what she sees. But that's not even the cliffhanger, because then later on there's further scenes in Numenor when Miriel and Elendil return, and there's just no mention of Isildur's sister and what happened with her. Just a very weird thing to include in this episode, in my opinion, especially because I feel like Isildur's sister is just not a character at this point. Like, she's been framed throughout the season like she's supposed to be a character who we are in any way invested in, but she just isn't. She's had like 3 scenes, and in all of them, again, she's been framed like a main character, but it's just been like 3 scenes. And her motives are weird. I still don't know why she was opposed to the campaign in Middle-earth. Just everything about her as a character baffles me. I don't get what they were going for, but whatever they were going for, I don't think they succeeded. Equally weird is the fact that Isildur is still quote-unquote dead. I was assuming that we were going to have scenes with Isildur in this episode. Leaving him officially dead at the end of the season is just a weird choice, because I don't think... First of all, I don't think there's many people who haven't seen Lord of the Rings. So I think that everyone on Earth basically knows that Isildur is going to live, and also knows his endgame in this show. But even the people who don't, I think, are not gonna buy that Isildur died, because he was clearly framed as a main character with some kind of grand destiny, and then he died basically off screen. So, like, no one buys this. Why are you doing this? Why is this a thing that the show wants us to apparently think? And then you even did the horse scene, which the horse scene, to anyone with the remote, like anyone who knows nothing about Lord of the Rings but has ever seen a movie, will look at the horse scene and know that Isildur is alive. So, I don't know, I guess... I don't know if we're supposed to believe that Isildur is dead, in which case no one does, you failed, or if we're supposed to know that he's alive, in which case why not show him? I don't know. Maybe the plot twist, the reveal isn't going to be that he's alive. Maybe we're supposed to know that he's alive, because I hope we are, because it's obvious. But the big reveal and plot twist next season will be where he's alive. Like, where he's ended up, or something. That's the only thing that occurs to me, that there's going to be, like, a massive plot twist around where he's alive. Anyway. Let's talk about the big main storyline of this episode, however, which is the reveal of Halbrand as Sauron, his confrontation with Galadriel, and the forging of the 3 Elven Rings of Power. And I have issues with this, but my issue is not with the fact that Halbrand is Sauron. While I do not see why people predicted this ahead of time, and I didn't see it coming at all, and I was in fact quite sure that I knew where Halbrand's story was heading, so this was a surprise, but it was a pleasant one. I actually think that this works. He works as Sauron. The story they ended up telling with him in this episode, however, is dubious to me. I'm going to start with what I really liked, and what I really, really, really liked about this episode, like, holy shit, it was easily the highlight of the entire show, was his mind battle with Galadriel, where he's throwing everything at the wall, trying every possible strategy to try and convince her to work with him. And a lot of them feel like they're almost going to work, but then he just pushes it a bit too far and loses her. And just everything about this scene was so good. The visuals were great. The performances were fantastic from both of them. The part where he quotes... Well, he doesn't quote it, obvious. He's not quoting it because, from his perspective, this is the first time it's being said. But he says a paraphrased version of the Dark Queen speech that Galadriel famously gives Frodo in Lothlorien. Thereby implying that when Galadriel was saying that, she wasn't just reciting sort of her idle fantasies and that she was afraid of coming to fruition if she ever came to power. She was citing a very concrete thing that she has been tempted by and almost fell for in the past. I think that was a cool... do you call it a throwback or a throw forward in this case? Whatever you want to call it. I think that inclusion was really good in this scene. I loved the visual of them on the raft, and then their reflection being them in like impressive regal armor as king and queen. Um, I loved I loved the fact that we can't really tell if any part of what Sauron was saying was genuine. Like, my gut instinct here is to say that obviously everything is a lie and Sauron is just a deceiver. But thinking back on the show, I feel like Halbrand genuinely was torn about whether to leave Numenor. I feel like we had scenes where Galadriel wasn't present and there was no need for him to keep up the charade, where it was very clearly communicated to us that he was very conflicted about this. And it does make me wonder. I do wonder if this is the version of Sauron who does see himself the way he told Galadriel. He does see himself as someone who is ultimately doing this not just for personal power or because he's evil, but because he thinks that this kind of tyrannical rule over all of Middle-earth with an iron fist is the only way to heal the world, to prevent future conflict, to sort of forge a new perfect world. And if he does feel that he's doing this for the greater good, quote unquote, even though obviously I'm not suggesting that he could be right, he's obviously wrong about that, but if he does feel that way, then I can see him being somewhat conflicted about whether it's worth it once Adar betrayed him, once one of his own men stabbed him in the back and left him for dead. And after everything he's gone through, I can see him kind of wondering, is this worth it? Should I just give up on this plan? Should I just live for a while in anonymity in Numenor? And then Galadriel, thinking that she was pushing Halbrand the human king to embrace his destiny, actually genuinely did push Sauron to return to Middle-earth and to his original plans. Again, this is sort of how I would like this to be framed. They might end up just framing it as him being an evil deceiver all along and everything being a lie, which would also be okay. I just think it would be less interesting. The other thing I really liked was, how do I put this? So, the moment I realized that Halbrand was Sauron was the moment he walked into Celebrimbor's workshop. Like I said, I did not have any suspicions of Halbrand until then. I was confident he was not Sauron. But the moment I saw him walk into Celebrimbor's workshop, before he even started talking to Celebrimbor, before they actually did anything, before he said that he brings gifts, which famously is what Sauron said to Celebrimbor, the moment he walked into the room, I jumped out of my seat and went, oh god, he's Sauron. Because it was obvious to me at that point. And what I like about the way this show was written, this episode rather was written, is that from that point onwards, I didn't have that frustrating feeling you sometimes get when you figure something out before a story expects you to, and then you're like, and then the story keeps building suspense up to the big reveal, and you're like, come on, I already know, and then when the reveal happens, it falls flat. I didn't feel that way. Instead, with this show, I felt like I was in on the joke. I felt like the show knew that I knew from that moment onwards that he was Sauron, and was written and directed in such a way that the tension wasn't who is Sauron, the tension was just, what will Galadriel do when she realizes it? And very quickly Galadriel figures it out. It doesn't take her very long, which I also like. We don't drag out that sort of tension of, oh, the viewer knows he's Sauron, but Galadriel doesn't. So I like that too. However, that brings us to my big, and I mean big problem with the events of this episode. The reveal that Halbran is Sauron is fine, but what he does is not. So, this is a case where I can see them maybe doing something interesting with this and maybe salvaging this in the future season, and maybe in retrospect I will look back at this and be like, oh, this was a good decision. I'm glad they changed this. But right now, the decision to have Halbrand just show up for a couple of days, or I guess weeks. I guess it's implied that he was there for 3 weeks, I believe. To have Sauron show up for 3 weeks and just teach Celebrimbor the art of forging Mithril, basically, and nothing else. And then have Celebrimbor forge the 3 rings and no others. And have all this happen before any other rings are created. And by the time the episode is over, Sauron is already gone and isn't manipulating Celebrimbor anymore. That's weird. So if you're not familiar, the way this story is supposed to go in the books is Sauron, the exact timeline escapes me, it's been a while, but Sauron is supposed to appear in his beautiful guise as Anatar, the Bringer of Gifts. And he is supposed to, I think with Celebrimbor's help, forge not the 3 Elven rings. He is supposed to help, with Celebrimbor's help, forge the 16 rings that are then divided into the 7 for the dwarves and 9 for humans. And he is supposed to offer those rings to those people as like a sign of peace and, oh, let's all get along, we're all friends now, and I'm giving you these rings of power as a gift. And they shall give you great power. And then those rings corrupt the humans to his side, and the kings of the men become Nazgul, and I don't actually know what they do to the dwarves. I think the dwarves manage to resist the corruption, but it comes at like a high cost or something, and a lot of the dwarven kingdoms are destroyed in the process. However you look at it, though, the point is, the 3 Elven rings are specifically the 3 that Sauron did not have a hand in making, and they were created by the elves in secret from Sauron as a response to the rings that he was already making. The show appears to be flipping that on its head. The show appears to be doing a storyline where the 3 Elven rings are the blueprint. These are the first rings of power, not the last. And they are what, presumably, Sauron will base the other 16 and then the 1 on, I think. And the problem with that is, that's cool and okay as a premise. That, fundamentally, I don't have an issue with. My issue is, why did Sauron want them to make these rings? What does he gain from it? If these rings, like the ones in the books, are actually free of his influence, and he cannot corrupt anyone through these 3 rings, and these 3 rings are in fact a potent weapon against him, why did he manipulate them into making them? What was his end game here? What was the scheme? Are we supposed to assume that because Galadriel figured him out, his scheme failed? Was this not his goal? Was it like, if he had stuck around, would he have corrupted the ring somehow? But now he hasn't because she chased him off? How did she chase him off? He just threw her in a pond, and then he could have he could have simply killed her. He could have simply killed her and then gone back to helping Celebrimbor or something. I'm very confused by Sauron's motivations here, now that I know that what was being created were just the 3 rings, and not the 16. It makes no sense to me right now. So that's my big issue, and this is a problem that the show has already had with the magic sword opening the floodgates. The show seems to have an issue with Sauron's motives in creating magical objects. Like, that's a weirdly specific issue to have twice. But so far we have 2 cases of Sauron creating powerful magical objects, which, if you think about them for like 5 minutes, you realize there's no reason he did this, as far as I can tell. Now, I think I know why they went with creating the 3 elven rings first. For a couple of reasons. First of all, I think they obviously Galadriel is obviously one of the main protagonists of this series, and they want to get that ring on her finger as soon as possible so she can have access to its powers, so they can do cool stuff with that. And secondly, I think that Celebrimbor isn't going to be the one who Sauron is going to seduce into creating the other rings. Durin is. I think that this season has pretty clearly set up the dwarves, and specifically Durin and Disa, to be extremely ripe targets for Sauron's manipulation. I believe Sauron will go to them next in some kind of guise and offer a way for them to get back at Durin's father, to take the throne for their own, and to finally start mining the Mithril. And in the process, he will probably also have them make the other rings. At least that's what the vibe I'm getting right now. But I think that they've set this up at the expense of the internal logic of Sauron's motives. I could be wrong. Maybe next season we'll find out that in this show's continuity, the 3 elven rings have been corrupted, and that actually was Sauron's goal. That could also be interesting. But if the rings aren't corrupted, as they are not in the books, then there's no reason why Sauron did this. And that's a problem. That's bad writing. So yeah, I don't know. Going forward, I don't know what to expect. Because the show has moments of utter brilliance, moments where it seems to understand these characters perfectly, such as all the interactions between Sauron and Galadriel, or the interactions between Nori and Gandalf. Moments where it's clearly doing something clever and something really creative and something really interesting and really cool. And then it has moments where it clearly dropped the ball so hard on thinking about the basic implications of what was actually happening. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope that this will all end up making sense, but I don't think it will. I don't think at this point we're going to get an explanation for the sword, for instance. And I don't know. I still have hope that we will get an explanation for why Sauron wanted Celebrimbor to make the rings. But I'm not sure we will. Because at this point, I don't necessarily think that the show cares about that kind of internal consistency. And I think it will sometimes sacrifice logic for the sake of getting the plot to where it wants it to get. And I don't think that's some kind of cardinal sin that cannot be forgiven, but it is bad, and I don't like when the show is doing it. So, okay. I don't want to end on that sour note, however, because my overall impressions of this episode were very positive. Like I said at the start, this was my favorite episode of the show pretty definitively, and that's a really good thing for a finale. If you make a show where the finale is the best part of the show, that I think is better than any other part of the show being the best part. It doesn't erase the fact that a lot of the middle parts of the show were pretty weak, but just like how a really weak finale can ruin a show retroactively, see Game of Thrones, a really strong one can kind of uplift the whole thing, because you're like, oh, sure, they weren't always doing the best stuff, but they were building towards something. They did have, like, something good and interesting in mind. And despite my issues with it, I do think that this finale was good. Now, I don't think that the show is as good as it could have been, or as it should have been based on the budget that it had. The absurdly high budget that it had. I think that I don't think that this is a problem of bad writers, however. I think this is a problem of corporate meddling and limitations. I think that this show could have been more interesting if the writers had been given a couple more episodes rather than having to make it an 8 episodes show. I think, for example, if this had been 10 episodes, a lot of the issues I have with the show could have been ironed out pretty easily. Because a lot of the issues I have, like the story that this show wanted to tell, I don't see a way to actually tell that story in this short amount of time and fix all the issues I have with the show. So a lot of the issues, I think, were inevitable if Amazon wasn't willing to budge on the number of episodes, and the showrunners weren't willing to budge on what kind of story they were planning to tell. And I feel like this show did end up suffering, much as I feared, a sort of much, much, much less severe version of what happened to Wheel of Time Season 1, which is that budget constraints and timing constraints and the insistence on having 8 episodes for no goddamn reason, because some algorithm has decided that that's optimal for streaming shows or whatever, that these things ultimately ended up getting in the way of telling a compelling story. In the case of this show, I think the positives outweigh the negatives, and the show did manage to sort of succeed at being good despite all of that. But it's painful in a way, because you can see that that with just a little bit less of those competing interests behind the scenes, the show probably would have been one of the best fantasy shows we've ever gotten, instead of being what it is, which is a pretty damn good fantasy show, but not one that, at least this first season, not one that's going to go into the history books the way that the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones will, for instance. Or, of course, the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy will. So, yeah, that's all I really have to say about this. Overall as a season, pretty good, falls just short of being great, though. And that's a damn shame, and something for which I choose to blame primarily the corporate side of Amazon, because I feel like I can see the fingerprints of corporate meddling on this show's script, and in particular, I can see absences where scenes were clearly supposed to be, further fleshing some stuff out, that got cut because of weird limitations on the number and duration of episodes. Make your shows longer, please. There's no reason to do this. There's no reason to limit yourself to 8 episodes of 45 to 60 minutes. Please make shows longer again. This sucks. The limited runtime is murder on creativity, I think. Yeah, that is my ultimate verdict. A very good, not quite great show, but a pretty great finale. The finale really raises the average quality of the entire season, I think, as does the previous episode. And I am excited for season 2 in a way that I didn't necessarily think I was going to be when watching episodes 4 and 5. So the show has succeeded at least getting me hooked, if nothing else. So I will see you all, well, who knows when I will next make a video like this, but obviously I will make some kind of you will see some video from me on Wednesday, probably not, which will not be about a show, it will be about a book, as most of my videos are. So hopefully see you then. If not, see you whenever season 2 of this show comes out, or whenever I decide to do another show. Maybe I'll watch House of the Dragon, who knows. Anyway, that's it for me. Goodbye.